All right, everybody, welcome to Office Hours with J and L, Jamal and Liam. Liam, it's good to be back with you for episode 2. I'm excited about this episode, just as I was excited about the first episode. And the topic today is capitalism. As we talked about before, we're going to alternate topics, and it's your turn to talk about capitalism. And so we're just going to jump right in and ask you some questions and have you share with us your perspective, definitions of capitalism, the various timelines, and then throughout the conversation, if things come up that I think are important to ask questions about, I'll do that. Does that work?
Oh yeah, for sure. Like interject whenever you want to, because the whole point here is to make sure that this is being clear.
Awesome.
And it's the same way. Like, gosh, if I was in classes or something, I would stop constantly and ask questions. So does that make sense? Does that make sense? It's harder to do like when you're having a conversation. It's not my natural mode. So by all means, whenever you've got anything to bring in there, ask questions.
You got it. You got it. So I think the first question I'd like to ask you, Liam, and it's important for our audience to understand, how would you define capitalism?
Yeah, it's It's kind of like the $10,000 question in a way, because there are a bunch of different ways that people do define it, and some very simple ones that are often very, very misleading. Because oftentimes the simple definition still kind of points to a lot of the underlying complexity, and people who know about that are going to get it, and the definition still works. So I can look at any standard definition and say, yeah, that's capitalism, but people tend to bring in then their own assumptions, and they miss what it's actually saying, like what a lot of the terms mean. The key there is first to distinguish it from the way a lot of people misuse it. A lot of people think that capitalism means a market economy. So a market economy is like basic exchange, like, I don't know, I sell cups of coffee, and you can buy a cup of coffee from me with your money or something else, like barter or something. We can exchange goods, right?
Right.
Commerce has been around for thousands of years. And this leads a lot of right-wing nutters out there on the internet to say that capitalism has been around for thousands of years. And it hasn't. Capitalism has been around for 5 centuries. It has some stages in the Middle Ages where it's developing, but it's a product of the early modern period. So we need to make that distinction first, because one of the single biggest mistakes that I see in the definition of capitalism comes especially from right-wingers and libertarians and conservatives who think that it's simply synonymous with commerce and markets. And it leads a lot of them down weird rabbit holes where they think that the state isn't necessary for capitalism to exist, because yes, people have been buying and selling forever, but that's not capitalism. Capitalism is literally a product of state centralization, which we'll get to a little later today, right? So it couldn't have existed before. And there's some key reasons for that. The basic definition, and I know this is still kind of hard, but the basic definition for this is that it's an investment model. Capital isn't the same as money. Capital isn't currency. Capital is money specifically for investment to make a profit. So I have $1,000 in my bank, but I need it to pay my bills. I have no capital. If I have $100 million in the bank and I don't need any of it to live on, I have capital because I can invest it. But it doesn't really become capital until I invest it in something. If I stuff $100 million in my mattress, it's not capital. It's still just money.
Right.
You see the distinction there?
I
Capital
do.
is currency that's invested for a profit. So capitalism is the process of investment to make a profit. And the specifics of it are how that investment works. What are the techniques? What are the things necessary for it? But at the end of the day, it's the investment process that you're talking about. That a system that involves investment, and private ownership of capital generally also has a market economy. That's where the confusion comes in. So people start thinking, oh yeah, free trade, and commerce, that's capitalism. No, it's not. Capitalism is specifically in the investment part, but it has those features as well. But those features, trade, currencies, market exchanges, they can exist in tons of other economic systems. The feudal manorial system had a market economy, but it wasn't capitalistic. It was manorial. we have a different word for a reason, like tons of economics, including many forms of socialism. They can have market economies. So
Makes sense. I like that you tie together the idea of taking assets, your liquid assets, money in this case, and investing it, and that's when it becomes capital. Um, why you earlier mentioned, Liam, that it was more right wingers that believe that capitalist society works as such, as this type of function. Why not left wingers? What's the distinction there?
Well, the people on the left, especially people on the left who actually know why they're on the left, generally know what capitalism is, or at least have more of an inkling of it, because left-wing capitalism, by definition, is a rejection of capitalism. This is where, especially in the US, and this is a really tricky question for a lot of Americans. Sorry, American peeps who are listening. A lot of Americans think that Democrats are left-wingers or that liberalism is a left-wing ideology, and it's not. Liberalism is by definition right-wing. It has always been a right-wing ideology from the beginning. As an economic principle, it is distinctly right-wing. The US has two right-wing parties and two right-wing factions that disagree more on social issues and the relative degree of, like, say, policing control and regulation. But that's about it. But they're both right-wing. Leftists reject the idea of accumulated capital for investment. It plays no part in left-wing economics at all. So you can, again, have a market economy with people buying and selling stuff and everything else, but it not be capitalist. And that would be the actual left. But generally speaking, people, especially in our society, you're going to grow up with basic, like, conservative or liberal perspectives, Republicans, Democrats, that sort of thing. And they're just different sides of the same right-wing animal. The people who embrace the left are people who generally who have run into what capitalism really is on some level.
I appreciate the distinction, because I think our audience may have considered what you said about right wingers or left wingers in their political parties differently than what you shared today.
Yeah, for sure.
And you may have said this, but what are the core principles that underpin capitalist economies?
Well, one of them is where the chief distinction shows up between the right and the left, and that is private ownership of capital and the means of production. And that also forces, sadly, another kind of definition, right? So the question of private property comes up a lot, right? Leftists oppose private property, so they want to take your cars or something. Like, this is not private property. This is not private property. These are personal property in economic terms. Like, anything that I don't use to specifically generate wealth is just personal property. So my house, my car, my books, anything, like, those are personal property. Private property in economic terms is property that generates wealth. So a factory, a bunch of farmland that people work on for me, something that produces profit for me, an apartment block that people are renting units in, right? That would be private property. Capitalism requires a concept of private property. That's one of its fundamental principles. Private ownership of the means of production. And just because I'm using that term, means of production means the things that generate wealth. That's all it means. So again, this is not the means of production. and face it, we're not going to get rich in a podcast, so this doesn't count either. but
you never know.
Block does, I mean, and at the end of the day, too, money that you make when you are okay. So let's actually run with the facetious example just for fun, right? So here's a point to make on that. First, if we make money on something that we're doing ourselves, so our own labor, then that's not really capitalism either. It doesn't involve capitalism. It doesn't really involve use of the means of production in that same economic sense. What we'd be looking at here is a direct partnership where we would split anything that comes out of this financially. If more people are getting involved in the production, then it becomes a co-op, and we split the proceeds around that. That's not capitalism, because if I owned it and you worked for me and I paid you $5 to sit here and talk to me, that would be private ownership of means of production. Assuming this makes money, because if it makes money and I keep that profit, that's when it becomes the means of production. Does that make sense so far?
It does. It does. And on that point, you said something earlier that resonated with me, which is home ownership. We often talk about home ownership in a way to generate wealth, but you said that is not a way to generate wealth, and it's not part of the capitalist system. It's not private property. I think that's what you said. It's personal property. Why is home ownership not considered a way to generate wealth or private property? Because we tout that so much.
Yeah, it's tricky because home ownership in the US is done within the context of finance capitalism, of late finance capitalism, which means it does generate tons of extra money just by sitting there because of we allow the buying and selling of land and homes and whatnot for a profit, and that pushes the value up. The value would only go up in, I guess, a more sensible economy if you're actually making some improvement to it, somebody likes it more, whatever, things naturally happen in an area that makes it more desirable or something. But this constant increase in the value of things that drives up that wealth that's being generated, that's a function of this economic system. It's like a byproduct of this system. But it's still not really capital because you can't invest it. You can't take that money out of it because you have the house, you're living in it. Once you buy two houses, that's playing the capitalist game, because now you're making money off of that and you're renting it. So some other poor sap has to pay you in order to live. That generates wealth, right? But the house that you live in, no matter how much it's worth, technically still wouldn't be capitalism, but it does appreciate in value in our system because of the system as a whole.
And so to that point, you talked about, home ownership, multiple homes. Could you consider taking the equity from a home and buying other homes as a way of a part of the capitalist system? Because you talked about it increases in value, right?
Yeah, I mean, so in that sense, you're taking a loan out on your assets, right? So it's not really your capital per se, but you are leveraging property in order to then take out a loan, purchase other properties. Where it becomes capitalism is where you're making money off it. So if you do that to buy yourself like a little holiday cottage on a lake somewhere, no, not capitalism at all. Right. Owning two houses does not make you a capitalist. If I own that second house and I rent it to someone, now I'm playing the capitalist game. And in that too, there's divisions of view on the value of even that kind of operation within capitalism. People like Adam Smith, for example, were severe critics of the idea of a rentier economy. The idea of charging people to use something, to live somewhere, is kind of like one of the black holes of capitalism, like a money suck that doesn't really produce real value, because the people who are investing and producing, the people who are renting houses don't have a great incentive to produce anything of real value. What they're doing is they're actually limiting the supply by buying it up, which drives the prices up, which is another thing that raises house prices. So it simply harms the economy as a whole. It stops more people from being able to buy a house. The simple existence of people with enough money to buy multiple houses, or now today corporations snapping them up, makes it impossible for most people to be able to easily to afford it. And now even the people who can, you're taking out massive bank loans that you're paying off for the rest of your life, rather than, my great grandparents and grandparents, they just bought their houses with cash. They literally just saved up money in a mattress and walked in and bought the house. Done. Like no big deal at all. That was normal. And for most of human history, that's how people have gotten houses. You'd see, oh, look, there's an empty hill over here. No one has a house on it. I'm going to go build my house on that hill. You didn't have to buy the land. You didn't have to take out a bank loan. You didn't do anything else. You just built a house and it was yours. And that was that. Or you walked in and said, hey, you're not using that house on the hill anymore, right? Cool. Here's $500 and I have your house. Cool. Done. Right. That was normal.
You mentioned someone earlier, and I think it'd be good and I'm going to ask you another question. Who is Adam Smith to the audience? You mentioned his name. Tell us who he is.
Smith is one of the developers of what we call liberal capitalism or laissez-faire capitalism. So it's it's a critique of the mercantile capitalist form that calls for allowing markets to essentially regulate themselves. He outlines a lot of the basic principles of what we technically call classical economics, although not just him, people like, Ricardo and Malthus, there's all kinds of people who contribute to that. Ultimately, Marx even is actually a classical economist. We tend to forget that. Marx has more in common with Adam Smith than not. It's only on the moral principles that they really differ. Their understanding of economics is almost exactly the same. So their classical economics is a specific moment in like the late 18th and the first half of the 19th century.
Terrific. Thank you. So my next question for you, and I appreciate you defining that for us and giving us timelines. So how does capitalism differ from other economic systems like socialism or communism?
Yeah, the simple fact is there are a ton of economic systems that have existed in world history. Some of them at the same time, but not always, because it's difficult for systems to coexist. So what mostly happens in a particular region is it goes through transformations, different stages, right? So there's essentially like look at the slave agriculture economics of the ancient world.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at, say, the Greek or Roman states, right? Rome was not capitalist, but it did have wealthy people who owned land, right? And a state that gave them the legal right to own that land, and it made money off of that. But it didn't actually accumulate capital to invest on like stock markets or something to produce businesses. So it was very difficult for individual landowners to innovate or do a whole lot, which is one of the main weaknesses of the Roman state, was its economic weakness. Technically they were capable of a whole lot more. Ancient Greeks and Romans actually invented steam engines, but they never did anything with them. They made like tea kettles on wheels as toys. It was like you couldn't do anything with it, but they understood the principle of steam power, right? So if they didn't have a slave agricultural economy, they might have invented locomotives. Who knows, right? Or like the feudal manorial system, right? Also, again, based in land. Both of these systems, the chief source of wealth is land ownership. So the state the state exists, but it's not terribly strong. Its main ability is to guarantee that somebody owns this chunk of land and such people have to work for them. It's still not capitalist because, again, no investment model. The socialist distinction, to think about, because I'm just giving you I'm pointing out that there's a lot more than just capitalism versus socialism. There are tons of economic systems in world history. The main one that the Arabs did, the Chinese one, there's tons of variations. The main distinction between socialism and capitalism is over that distinction we made earlier, though: private ownership of the means of production. For socialists, it has to be some form of social ownership. Where they differ, and people often, the chief way to do this, the one single overriding defining point about socialism is social ownership of the means of production. That's it. But whether it needs a state or no state, right? So like the Marxist-Leninists versus anarchists, they're both socialists. You can have no state or a very strong state. You can say government should own the means of production, or you can say individual workers would own it. You can say, and where you can distinguish between socialism and communism is a hypothetical state. There have been points in human existence where we've been close to various aspects of it, but it's an attempt to recapture that in an industrial age. And no one's ever done it. There have been communist countries, big C communism, as in a country ruled by a communist party, but none of them have ever said they've come close to achieving communism, small c, because they can't. The state still exists. For communism envisions a state withering away, ceasing to exist. So in that way, it gets back to where the anarchists wanted to start, there in the end. But it also gets rid of the entire monetary system. So there's no market exchange. Things are just produced collectively and distributed to people who need them. Most socialists don't actually want communism. Some socialists do. A lot of socialists actually prefer the idea of basic exchange. So again, for example, think about our small scale here. There's
Yep.
2 of us working on this. We bring in 3, 4, 5 more people making graphics, websites, doing video editing, whatever here. We create a co-op. We create a business where the money that's made by it gets distributed to the people who do it. We're all joint owners of it rather than employing somebody. That's one of the main distinctions. Socialism rejects the concept of employment because it rejects the idea of private ownership. If somebody doesn't own the factory, he can't employ you. If everybody who works in the factory jointly owns the factory together and elects their bosses and votes on how to distribute the profits, then it's not privately owned. But it also isn't state owned. You see the difference? It's owned by the workers. Socialists want some kind of collective ownership, whether that's direct worker ownership or state ownership, depends upon the model of it. But they all reject private ownership of the means of production.
You know, it's interesting you say that, you know, co-oping, we're using the podcast as an example, co-oping the podcast, right? Everybody does their fair share of work. Everybody gets paid equally, which brings me to my next question. And maybe, you know, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but what are the main criticisms of capitalism regarding income inequality?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, that is something that people criticized about it from the beginning. The criticism of inequality is actually at the basis of the creation of capitalism. It was in part a way to deal with people's resentment of earlier forms of inequality, different ways to concentrate power and centralize the state to protect those concentrations of power and wealth. So yeah, it's inextricable from the whole process. It has to generate inequalities and massive, massive inequalities, which is one of the fun points that leftists will often make. And right-wingers are just like, what? That makes no sense. Like, I'm sure you've heard the line that capitalism has raised a huge number of people out of poverty. Therefore, it's a good system, right? That's literally false. It's raised no one out of poverty. You know, it's not capable of doing so. There are forces that have raised people out of poverty in the modern period, but they're not capitalism. You know, oftentimes they are the state attempts to regulate things or redistributive policies or things like that that actually restrain the capital system, but not capitalism itself. What capitalism does by its nature is creates poverty. And by poverty, we have to understand that poverty is always relative, right? Poverty isn't that somebody has, you know, like it's not a set amount of money, right? So if, you know, if you're comparing, okay, so this runs in a lot of times too, and people are looking at, say, the record of the socialist economies in the 20th century. And they say, oh, well, look, socialism is a failure because clearly they had lower standards of living than Western European countries did. Like, yeah, no shit. They had that before they adopted those economies. I mean, if they were a dirt poor feudal agrarian economy and then started industrializing and getting richer, clearly the system worked. But that they're further behind has nothing to do with anything because they were already behind. So they're both increasing the amount of overall wealth. But where we talk about poverty in technical terms, in economic terms, it's a little bit different than the way a lot of us use it casually. You know, because we're thinking more about, does somebody have any money at all, right? And poverty is always relative. So when you look at somebody in the U.S. that's making, say, only $20,000 a year, right? If you take that $20,000 and you put them in like Malawi in Southern Africa, they're damn well off. That's a lot of money. 20,000 US dollars is a lot of money in that economy. But here, you're dirt poor and you're going to be doggy paddling at best and probably sinking into farther and farther into debt. There's no way to really survive at 20K a year in California, or probably really at this point anywhere in the US. Poverty is relative to the system that you're in and to the cost of living where you are. And capitalism, because it concentrates wealth, because it takes most of the benefits of productivity. So the money made by our labor, and it takes most of that and it gives it to the investor class and the owner class, then by definition, it's creating poverty because the same amount of money produced. So again, think about our small thing here, like this as a tiny business, or like, I don't know, my mom and pop dry cleaner business or whatever, and you've got a handful of people working for you. All the money that's being generated there, right? If you're running a dry cleaning business and there's like 5 people who work there, right? If you don't have to pay back a big bank loan, if you don't have to pay back investors, and shareholders, and all the money goes just to the people who work there, then they make more money.
Right.
More of that money stays in their hands. Once you subtract all the operating costs and everything else, all the profit is theirs. Where in the capitalist system, most of it goes to the capitalists. So by that simple process alone, it is creating relative poverty, because it's letting some people accumulate money just because they already had money, because they were able to invest in the business in the first place. You make money by sitting on your ass because you already had it.
And so I think, what's you mentioned that's interesting to me is I worked in banking for 30 years, and I dealt with clients at various, wealth levels, and those that had land ownership, because you mentioned land ownership earlier, which seems to be the way people generate wealth. One way is through land ownership, right? Multi-unit properties, shopping centers, you name it. And then I've dealt with customers who want to use the bank's money when it's cheap. Obviously, it's not cheap right now because of inflation, because the Fed hasn't cut rates. But there's still people out there that would rather use financial institutions and their money versus using their own. Why is that? Why do people think that way?
That makes sense only once we get to like a very late stage in capitalism, and we understand what the finance capitalist model is, because it's where today no wealthy person is actually going to spend their own money. They're always leveraging something else. They're always taking loans because that's simply cheaper. It's how our system is currently built, and it's actually deeply harmful. It's an almost parasitic way to run an economy. It doesn't help ordinary people, because it actually raises a lot of costs. But that only makes sense if you can roll back the finance capitalist system as people's need to survive within it, to thrive within the existing system. No, of course you're going to do that. It's by far the cheapest, easiest way to do it. The problem is the system is badly designed to begin with. It's extremely inefficient. And that's what makes it cheaper to do things like that. But even there, land ownership is actually a very tiny part of wealth generation in a finance capitalist economy. It's the thing that most affects like ordinary people or middle income people who can actually afford to accumulate any property. Because again, a lot of Americans never can at all. But as soon as you can acquire a house at all, and you enter that property owning class, it's the chief way that you, as the individual who owns that property, can generate wealth. But most of the wealth in this country is owned by a tiny, tiny share of it. The top 10% globally control more than 3/4 of all wealth on the planet.
Wow.
Like that, if you give you some idea of scale there, right? Most of that wealth is not from land ownership, because the land can only generate so much, right? Land ownership generates money only through like rent, development, agriculture, things like that. It doesn't produce the massive profits that the finance capitalist system does, but it is a source of wealth for us, to help keep us afloat in a badly designed system.
You talked about the inefficiencies earlier in terms of the financial system, and in context of individuals borrowing money from institutions when it's cheaper. What are like the top 2 or top 3 inefficiencies that resonate with you when you stated that? What are those inefficiencies?
Oh gosh. Okay, I'll give you a basic one there. But again, I think the way to preface this is, again, thinking that we're trying to keep these to between an hour and 2 each as episodes. I think a lot of those kind of questions make sense once we actually have developed the neoliberal and finance capitalist systems that we have here in the late 20th and early 21st century, because the way the banking system works changes markedly through different periods. The way it works today is not the way it worked in the 1950s. The way it worked in the 1950s is not the way it worked in the 1880s. I mean, there are significant shifts in the system as a whole, and they change the logic behind all of that. But the single biggest one, I'll give you just as a kind of a top level point and kind of related to your profession. Private banking itself doesn't make sense. It's something that people really understood intuitively and for a long time. Christians opposed usury. Muslims opposed usury, like the idea of making money off of loans, like, and that's what a bank does. That's the core of its business, is trying to generate wealth by taking money in. Today, it's a little bit different. And that, again, where the system today is, I mean, banks today lend out several times more than they actually have. And that's them exploiting a very fragile finance capitalist system, which is why we're constantly having to bail it out with, money that we keep printing. It's a whole different question there. But banking as a whole, private banking, think about just as a basic concept. I want to start a business. Say I want to go into business for myself as a plumber. I want to open up a shop there and buy a truck and the equipment and get 3 guys to work with me to do this. And cool, we're going to start a plumbing business. Well, I got to go get a loan for that, which means I have now to pay interest on that loan out of the profit that I would make from my business, right? And that interest can be quite high. It is a major contributor to the fact that 90% of all businesses created in this country fail. And I can't underline that enough, because people really should understand just how inefficient our current system is. If 90% of your businesses fail, you are running a really shitty market economy, because that's not how this should work. But that's one of the inefficiencies of capitalism causing that, and the banking system plays a significant part in that because of the profit that needs to come in on the loans. Imagine instead a cooperative bank, one owned by the community, right, where the money is just pooled there, and startup loans or grants are just given to people out. So, like, I want to start a plumbing business. Cool. Here's my business plan. I got 3 guys with me. We want to buy a truck and a shop, blah, blah, blah. And like, cool. Here's this grant to get started, and pay us back when you're profitable, without interest. So once the business succeeds and is stable on its own, so you're not paying back money while you're trying to establish a business. Once you're successful and profitable, then you pay back the principal that you took in, no interest. Can you imagine how much more efficient that would be? Most businesses would succeed. It would be down to the competence of the people at it, as opposed to the vagaries of the market and competition and everything else. If I'm going to open up a plumbing business, Roto-Rooter is going to crush my ass because they've got tons of money. I can't compete. So, I mean, and my need to compete means I have to spend so much more than I possibly can make, which means I fall farther into debt. My business gets more and more leveraged. I'm struggling to get by here. And eventually I collapse. Within 10 years, more than 90% of businesses have failed. Most of them have failed within the first year or two. So it's very, very difficult. And the banking system is actually a part of that problem.
And I think we'll get into later on, maybe the next episode, there are programs out there that related to businesses where you can qualify for grants depending on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But see, that's, again, the fun thing about that is it gets to the distinction between capitalism helping people versus the welfare state, because that's a government program throwing in money, and they are band-aids on a broken system. Because if everyone took advantage of every possible program, none of them would survive. They wouldn't be able to be approved for it. There's not enough money available to it. They're attempts to try and keep the motors going, as it's sputtering along. There's tons of things that have been done like that, and this is one of the things that really bothers me about the right libertarians too, is them trying to say, well, dismantle all those programs. Like, cool, so the entire economy collapses completely. I mean, you just restore feudalism overnight if you do. But those state programs are useful, and they do help ordinary people, but they're actually a separate point from the system itself.
Right. And I think the example that resonates with me as you talk about that is during the pandemic, when we had the Triple P program, right? My next question for you, and
good point there. A nice side point on there too, and one of the places where, again, if you thought beyond capitalism and the welfare state and just thought about what would be the most efficient way to save a market economy from a pandemic like that, just like grants, like pay people to stay home, pay businesses to do the necessary changes so that they could reopen, and then everything goes back into it. Because all that money that had to go into putting all the plastic shields up everywhere and all the equipment that had to come out there, just provide that directly. Instead, It was a ton of loans, only to a small number of people. Most people couldn't get them. Few people were paid any kind of direct money for themselves to make up for their costs or their staying home. So tons of small businesses suffered. Tons of ordinary people suffered. But then a whole lot of rich people took out these PPP loans and then didn't bother paying them back. So it was just like a free run to the till for them. It was an extremely inefficient way of doing something.
I remember being part of that rollout process with the financial institution that I was working for. And there was a pretty rigorous process to get approved. And there was forgiveness depending on the circumstances at some point. But again, we'll get into that. I do want to ask you another question and tell me if this is on the right track here. What are the primary, or let me ask you, can you explain the concept of the invisible hand in capitalist markets?
Yeah.
I think of like, here's my hands invisible now, but I'm just kidding.
Yeah. It makes sense when we're talking about liberal capitalism. So if we can start running chronologically through a few pieces, then I naturally would get to that. If that makes sense.
Cool. Yeah, totally. So let's where do you want to start in terms of let's take a step back. So modern and global perspective. Can we start there? That's kind of the subheading here. How does globalization interact with capitalism?
Now that's another issue that's much more modern too. Globalization in its economic form, because there are different aspects of it, is tied to liberal capitalism as well. Mm-hmm. So the heyday of globalization is actually 19th century. And in some ways, arguably, the 19th century is still more globalized than we are today, which is weird to think because, we can now communicate with people instantly all around the world. It's much quicker to get places. Goods move from all over the place. All my plastic shit can now be made in Vietnam and shipped across the ocean. That's cheaper than making it here. All kinds of stuff like that. But there were far fewer controls on capital, on goods, and on labor. In the 19th century, there were no controls on migration even. People just moved. My ancestors just walked into this country. They just got here and walked in. That was it. There's no application process. There's no vetting, nothing. You just got in a ship and moved. Humans have moved all the time. So free movement of labor, capital, and goods, all three. That's globalization kind of in a nutshell. In the contemporary world, we've replicated a number of those, and we have a new form of neoliberal globalization that does have tighter controls on people's movement, but actually fewer controls on capital, and but still about the same in goods overall. In fact, in some ways, the markets were still freer in the 19th century in terms of goods too. Capital is really the only main beneficiary of contemporary globalization in terms of the flows. But again, that as a question makes much more sense once we get to a distinctly modern form of capitalism, because globalization didn't play the same part in earlier stages in it.
As the good host that I am, and I'm listening to you loud and clear, you want to go timeline by timeline, and somewhat,
yeah,
and
in some ways, in some ways. At least in terms of like defining something,
Got it. Makes sense.
But yeah, as you're going along in different sections, there are parts that do make sense. But yeah, I guess part of it is just an old pedagogical habit.
It's good.
Sometimes you're like putting the cart before the horse sort of thing. It's hard to like try to explain something before you've laid the foundations that actually make it make sense. So if I try to explain how economic globalization works today without building up what liberal economics even is, then I'm having to, it's a lot more confusing, I guess.
So if I went back to the 16th to 18th century, mercantile capitalism, you mentioned that earlier on. Good place to start there in terms of the characteristics and policies and impact?
Sort of. I want to take a slightly, I'm going to look at the period just before that. There's a few things that happen in the medieval that actually set the stage for the creation of capitalism that are actually essential. And especially if people want to understand what is capitalism at all, right? And how is it different from earlier systems? This again gets back to the way that people are constantly misusing the word. Capitalism was a specific solution to a specific set of problems that developed. So the first thing I'll point to is that there are a number of interesting innovations in the Muslim world, in the Abbasid Caliphate. So I'm thinking here like 8th through 12th centuries. So kind of like the golden age of Islam. And they don't hit all of it, but they do actually create what some people call Islamic capitalism, kind of like early forerunner of mercantile capitalism. It doesn't have all the basic features of what we can call capitalism. And I tend not to use the term because it specifically doesn't have a lot of the profit-based capital investment that makes sense for, again, defining capitalism, because usury is still a problem for Islam, where Christians eventually removed their restrictions on it. Islam technically has not, although they come up with all kinds of weird BS ways to get around it in banks today, you know. Oh, a whole bunch of extra fees. Oh, cool, that works the same way. Whatever. But they do create a number of very important things. So first off, there's a stable currency. Without a stable currency, a capitalist system can't exist. This is still not a great one because, honestly, we don't get the first modern currency until the Dutch guilder in the 17th century. But get to that later. But the gold dinar provides at least a standard, and it becomes such a widely used standard that it's used all over Europe. Vikings are taking it back in. It restores like actual currency use in Europe as well, because it's relatively stable currency. But they create a whole lot of neat banking innovations on top of that. And to make capitalism work, to invent capitalism, you need banks. Banks are, all the financial instruments around there are essential. And you also need some state instruments, some state legal things. So Muslims create the concept of like legal trusts, you know, like a trust property, somebody else doing it. Think about how a waqf works, right? So this is something owned by the community, but operated by this particular person. Right. So that as a legal vehicle within the state is a Muslim invention. Partnerships are mudaraba, I think. There's a system for partnerships that develop in the Islamic Middle Ages, allowing for multiple people to pool their money in a sense. So there's a legal protection for that. It's not yet to where we can have large numbers of people investing, but it's expanding the field a little bit legally. Bills of exchange and promissory notes. Jamal, I'm going to owe you $500. I will pay you back when I can. Here's a document that says I owe you $500. Basically an IOU. Muslims invented IOUs, right? They didn't exist before. And in part, they're a product of wide use of paper, which was actually invented a few centuries earlier in Han China. But in the 8th century, Muslims, captured a paper maker at a battle in 751 at Talas River. And they brought him back to Baghdad, and they had to do mass producing paper, and they found all kinds of interesting uses for it. And one of those was keeping bank ledgers and producing promissory notes and contracts and the personal check, writing checks, so, hey, all this gold is in my bank back there, but here's a check that lets you take that gold out. And I've signed that you can go to that bank and you can take money out of my account, because that's what a check is.
Right.
Instead of me having to bring you a big ass bag of gold, I can give you a nice piece of paper that lets you go to the bank and get that gold whenever you can. Make sense so far?
It does. And you mentioned mudraba, which for our audience, let me define that. So, and Liam did a really nice job. Mudraba is a partnership where one party provides the capital, rab al-mal, and the other provides expertise in management, which is mudarib, right? Profits are shared according to a pre-agreed ratio, while losses are borne by the capital provider unless due to the manager's negligence. So mudraba, that's the word.
Right. And why is this important in the history of capitalism? Because you're creating the beginnings of the managerial class. Because in the ancient world, the property owner had to manage his own property. So I own a massive estate. I have to run that damn thing. It's my responsibility. If anything goes wrong, I mean, I have to know how to do that, right? But now I can instead set up deals. You can start creating legal vehicles where somebody else manages the things entirely for you, runs the business, does all these different things. And there's certain protections on either side for the people involved, right? In terms of the profits, losses, everything else. So you're starting to create the legal foundations for modern businesses, which the ancient world absolutely did not have. It's endlessly frustrating. People telling me like, "Oh yeah, capitalism was around for 5,000 years." I'm like, no. But like tons of the basic principles that make it possible did not even start coming into existence until the Middle Ages. So those kind of partnerships are an important step toward the creation of the modern business and the modern professional classes.
Awesome. So if I'm listening to you today and you're kind of going through the path historically, what's the next thing I want to know from Liam? I may not be one very well versed in the capitalist society, the origins, historically, the changes. What's next? What should I know?
Well, the next thing there is, how do we get from there to, well, obviously capitalism, the form that we recognize, is a European development.
Mm-hmm.
But Europe, economically, and for most of our history, is a backwater. It was not a terribly innovative area. It was an almost entirely agrarian economy. And it becomes this massive powerhouse only from the early modern period on. But the processes to start putting it on that path happen in the Middle Ages, when they start borrowing a bunch of ideas. So all these different legal innovations the Muslims are doing, they're all borrowed into Europe. And they're borrowed into Europe near the end of the period too. So they start being taken in the 12th and 13th century. And they become useful as a response to some of the challenges that Europe began facing by the time it got to the 13th century. Because here you've got feudal economies, what we call feudal in economic terms. This is one of the things I hate that Marx used the term this way. Marx actually defined feudalism and capitalism as economic terms. But, capitalism is a great innovation. He invented the word. Feudalism is a bad misuse of an earlier word, because feudalism was just the political system. Manorialism is the better term for the economic system, but whatever. So when I'm talking about economic theory, I tend to say feudal manorialism or just manorialism. But for our sake, I'm going to talk about feudalism, right? But please, for anybody who really cares, feudalism is technically just the political concepts, like the liege and vassal and all that, whatever. But the economic system there is, I own a bunch of land, and I have peasants working on that land. And those peasants work that land for me in exchange for protection. I have to build a castle. Castles weren't nice houses to live in. They were fortresses that were very uncomfortable to live in. But my responsibility, taking the money in from the peasants' products, like if I take a share of what they're producing all the time, I'm spending it hiring and training men at arms, building walls, building defensive fortifications. So when, Vikings or Arabs or Magyars or whatever come in and attack, they can come inside the castle and I have a responsibility to protect them. That deal that starts to beginning to develop as the Roman Empire is collapsing and lasted for centuries was really running into trouble by the time you get to the 13th, because the population had gone way up. Cities were growing. There was an increasing urban environment. There was a much larger population. There was a lot more unrest, especially in the wake of the Black Death, which wiped a lot of people out. So then the people who were left, they could demand higher wages. People were increasingly unhappy with the system as it existed. So all across the 13th century, huge numbers of peasant revolts. People are just freaking out and burning shit down. Like, oh, you think you can tell us what to do? We're going to go burn down the manor house and be free, yo. And torches and pitchforks. So
come on.
Yeah, there's just dozens and dozens of them in every part of Europe. They're all over the place. And some of them got massive. So people needed a way out of that. They needed a system. So it's one of two of the main driving factors in a process of state centralization. So centralizing the power of the state. The other is technological. Once the Mongols brought Chinese gunpowder across Eurasia, it starts an arms race. Because as soon as I build a 3-inch cannon, you're going to build a 4-inch cannon. So I got to build a 5-inch cannon. And now you got better range. Oh shit! I got to make better gunpowder and get better range. So we got to spend more money. So militaries get more professional. The two main drivers here are how to control a growing population and the arms race. But the result is gradual centralization of state power. And that allowed European states to begin applying a lot of the different financial innovations, because the monopoly of force that states could claim meant that they could protect property owners. So now I own this giant apartment block and I'm a slumlord and I'm treating a bunch of people like shit. Well, they might get mad and stop paying their rent. Well, I can have the state throw them in jail. or they like get out in the streets and riot. Well, I can just have the cops shoot them. You know, like I have got a government to back me, if that makes sense. So you start to build stronger governments. That's a big step in Europe.
And so I wanted to define feudalism timeline, 9th to 15th century. Is that an accurate?
Sort of. The mature form of it.
Got it.
Feudal economics actually begin developing in the 4th and 5th centuries, out of a lot of people sort of fleeing Roman cities because of increasing tax rates. And like, so the rich leave first, like, you're not going to tax me, bro. I'm going to go out to my country villa and live there. And then now you got to raise taxes on workers. So the workers sort of fleeing the cities and saying, hey, bro, can I work for you? And you protect me from the government? And like, yeah, cool, I'll do that. And that creates the beginning of the compact between peasants and the owner class. So it creates the basic, feudal arrangement,
Got it.
But again, feudalism as a political system, really, it develops a bit later. And in that way, it's much more of a 9th century development. But the beginnings of the economic system go back a bit earlier.
And you mentioned manorial system, and you're spot on. The manorial system was the basic economic unit where, for those listening, where lords owned large real estate or manors. Peasants or serfs worked the land in exchange for protection and a place to live. For those of you listening, just to underscore the importance of what manorial system is and what Liam was referring to. So
it creates serfdom.
Go for it.
It creates serfdom in the peasantry. Ultimately, the key there, and why it's a matter of the decline of the Roman state. Honestly, this is one of the I make jokes about this for a lot of like right libertarians today. Like the big L libertarian party types who want to like, get rid of government, but capitalism is fine. Like, bro, you're talking about manorialism, because the key here is rich people fled the state. So poor people fled the state as well. Rich people said, I'll protect you from the state in exchange for all of your labor. And it took the place of large scale slavery, because slavery only worked with a powerful centralized state. Without the state and the army to protect you from slave revolts, no one's going to keep thousands of slaves. They would just rise up and kill you. But a bunch of peasants who made a deal, or whose ancestors made a deal to work for you in exchange for protection, that's different. It seems more voluntary, so people accepted it. That's manorialism in a nutshell. It creates a permanent underclass. Most people are laboring in the land, and a small number of people own the land, and they have a responsibility simply to provide protection. But that system is fraying by the time you get to the 13th century is the problem here. And without like going way off the rails, a whole big discussion on the Middle Ages. I'm not going to get into like why it's really getting bad, but it really was getting very difficult to sustain. So innovation was necessary. And so that's the process of building capitalism.
So I'm listening to you, and man, there's a ton of information to unpack, right? I'm an audience member. So we're talking about, feudalism, manorial system. So what should I know next? I'm a listener. I'm really intrigued. What should I know next about capitalism?
The next thing, honestly, might be the interplay with religion, which seems weird, but it's and I don't know it, strictly speaking, in the way a lot of people point to elements of Protestantism here as fundamental, but there is an element of, especially the Puritan ideal that plays a part in this. But the interplay with religion is kind of important here, because one of the other factors that saw a steady decline in the medieval world order was that in Catholic Europe, they believed they had a kind of moral economy, that no one was going to be trying to make a ton of profit off of somebody else. We were all ultimately servants of God and just like working the land to be good people. And, most people there weren't huge disparities in wealth. It wasn't as big a deal there. But when people begin to find some ways to do that, when some people start getting richer, there's more criticism. In fact, one of the main fault lines within the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages was that the church had become massively rich, and a lot of the people who worked for it hated that idea. And they wanted the church to declare a vow of poverty and get rid of all the gold. They're like, bro, I like living well. I didn't want to change. But so they had to begin rationalizing that. And that ultimately led to some significant changes for a while. And this is one of the reasons that it creates some long-term problems between Christians and Jews, although their problems go back 1,000 years before this point. But Jews were sometimes forced into the role of being money lenders to governments. Now, this is not to most people. Most people didn't use banks in the Middle Ages. Governments took out loans from banks. Most people did not. It's a very different world than the one we live in. You know, you're it's like you're going to the bank and you're literally walking out with a bag of gold and you're using that and then going back with it. It's a very, very different world. Most people didn't do things like that. The governments, though, did need money, so they turned to some Jewish merchants to lend money because Catholics were not allowed to, and because monarchs kept expelling the Jews and seizing their profits. You know, they would get angry at it, like, "Hey, you're charging us interest." Like, yeah, you signed a deal because you needed the money for your damn war, so we loaned you money for your war. Like, well, I don't want to pay you back, so get out of my country and I'm going to seize all your assets. And that happens over and over again. So the Catholic Church eventually thinks, well, you know what? People are doing this stuff anyway. They start wanting to make money. Not only do governments have larger expenses, but businesses are starting to want to grow. And one of the big driving factors here were these Italian Catholic merchant republics. So Pisa, Genoa, Amalfi, Florence, Venice, you know, all these city-states that were producing large merchant fleets, and they were carrying the goods that were coming off the Silk Roads. All these things that were like terminating in like Syria and whatever, they're taking the port stuff from those ports and they're shipping it all over the place. And they're making money moving goods around. So it's recovering a merchant class, and the merchant class is becoming more and more important as an economic motor. That's a process that continues all through the Middle Ages. By the time you get to the late Middle Ages, merchant families were richer than the big landowners already. So the people who had titles like I'm the Duke de such and such, I'm forced to like marry my kids into merchant families because I can't afford my castles or my estates anymore, because most of the money is being made by merchants. So the Catholics had to relax their views on usury, and now Italian banks start showing up using the same basic model as the Muslims, but charging interest like the Jews did. So from there, it creates a foundation to start building the modern banking system and modern state currencies. But the fight over usury and the decline of the moral economy, the sense that we're all like, I don't know, I guess working in God's paradise or whatever, and not trying to make money. I mean, because honestly, if you take the gospel seriously, you're supposed to be poor and focus on the kingdom of heaven, you know? So Christians saying, hey, it's totally okay for me to make a shitload of money and have nice clothes was an innovation. And it was actually quite controversial for ordinary people to start saying they should be able to get rich.
There's a shift in mindset.
Yeah, right? Exactly. It's a major paradigm shift, and it actually plays a part in the Protestant Reformation, and very much a less well understood part in it. A lot of the territories in Europe that adopted Protestantism did so because they wanted to change their political and economic order, not because of the theology. Because by breaking with the church, it freed them up to do a whole lot of things that they weren't able to do before. And there's already a drift in that direction toward thinking being a merchant is okay. You know, by the time you get to people like Erasmus, when Erasmus has himself painted, he has himself painted looking in his merchant guise, not like in a library or kind of like in a very scholarly, like because he's a nerd, right? But he wants to look like a wealthy merchant. That was becoming hip. Like it's a major shift between the late medieval and early modern. So the decline there of that particular type of religiosity is fundamental, right? And ultimately it's the foundations of the weird like prosperity gospel shit that you get today, where like Jesus wants you to be rich, and like, and you get rich by, of course, buying me a jet, but whatever, like all this, God wants you to be really, really rich. Like medieval monks would be like, what the fuck are you talking about? That's not what this book says.
That's not what it's all about. Yep.
Right. So that has to change first.
So we're at the hour, and I want to feel like I'm contributing to the conversation other than just asking questions. So I do want to kick it off next time, because you talked about Christianity and capitalism. Yep. Obviously, we can talk about Islam and capitalism, Hinduism and capitalism, Judaism and capitalism, Buddhism and capitalism. There's so many different categories. I mean, we could sit here for hours and talk about capitalism. I did want to kind of wrap us up here and just say thank you.
Interesting. All right.
Because it's a ton of information. We're at an hour.
Yeah, it kind of is. It kind of is.
And I know you can go forever.
Get through like I don't know, the early modern, like the joint stock companies and banking and stuff, but we can always pick that up another time too, because from these early antecedents, we don't really get to capitalism until like the 16th and 17th century. So then there's that transformation. But yeah, we can do these in different stages. So another day we can come back and we can let's talk about early modern capitalism. Let's look at 16th, 17th, 18th century capitalism and set the foundations for the 19th century and industrialization. And then we can look at the move from industrial capitalism to finance capitalism, because massive transformations between the 19th and the later 20th century.
That would be awesome.
Well, honestly, the questions thing, that's key, because that drives things, and that'll be true. I mean, if you start talking about Muay Thai, I'm like, cool, I've heard these words, right? And that's about the extent of my knowledge. I know it has something to do with fighting, and I've heard the two words. So I'm gonna have to a lot of like, okay, and how is that like this? I'm gonna ask a lot of questions.
you can go to ChatGPT. You'll be fine.
Well, I'm just saying that. I mean, I think asking questions when is a really useful technique. I'm just suggesting, like, as a way of like introducing concepts to people, because we don't know the extent to which any individual listener knows something about something. So if somebody else is like me and knows nothing about mixed martial arts, Muay Thai, anything like that, then cool, I get to play the part of the idiot and ask cool questions.
Well, that was the thing today. It's like today I'm okay, what do I ask him? Because I know Liam can go on for hours on a lot of topics, but I want to feel like I'm a bit smart today. And so I'm like coming up with these questions, and I know how concise and clear you like to be in terms of the questions, which I appreciate. It was a good discussion. I really appreciate, the thoughtfulness behind the information. I think people would hopefully appreciate that. What do you have?
Foundation. I really hope it's a good foundation for people to start building on, because what we can do over a few different times of this, because we're going to bounce around for a bit, so we might come back to this in a month or two, whatever. But we'll carry these things along, and what you can do over time is we're learning more about a particular topic, how to use these things. But hopefully, out of today, we've got the basic distinctions between capitalism and commerce, capitalism and market economies, capitalism and socialism. Right. So they've got a little bit to go from there. And then the fact that it does have a very specific historical origin, that it does develop as a response in the early modern period to problems in the Middle Ages and innovations in the Middle Ages. They're all a way to get around certain issues that they're dealing with. And what they do is they create a system that solved their problems. It did solve the problems of the late Middle Ages, but the problem they're really trying to solve is, how can we protect the rich who are being threatened by these revolts? How can we deal with these angry people in the cities? Like, it's a matter of like trying to guarantee control in some way, and shifting to a new type of system and a new way of understanding our relationship to each other and to the economy. People before, they didn't like the idea of exploiting their neighbors. And there's tons of critiques of that in the Middle Ages. The idea today of like trying to go out there and make a buck, and you want to have employees and whatnot, would have made no sense to them. So it's a major paradigm shift. It did solve problems for them, but it does create problems going forward. So if we've got that as a foundation, we can start going into and develop mercantile capitalism to liberal capitalism next time. So your question about Adam Smith, that'll be in part 2 of this.
Awesome. And what's interesting is that protecting the rich at the outset is still the same today.
I mean, yeah, ultimately that's what a lot of this system is built around, but it's sold to people as a kind of freedom, and that we can all be rich. Like in Steinbeck's phrase, we're all just temporarily embarrassed millionaires. We're all going to someday be super rich. Someday it'll be me living on the hill. That's the dream that they sell us. It's literally never been the case. Like at any point, this is one of the things that you get from a ton of like economic history. Just if you look at the data over centuries, it's never been true. I don't know if you've ever heard like the Horatio Alger myths, like, so like early 20th century America, the whole rags to riches story. You can be some dirt poor immigrant and you can have the big castle on the hill and be like super, super rich, like you can be the next Carnegie or something,
They make it sound so easy.
Right. But it's
not
ordinarily difficult. And the number of people who can squeeze through that to get to the end, the system is always, by definition, going to limit that because it can't do anything but it's designed to create that inequality. So if we could all get rich, it'd be socialism. I mean, that's the thing. So it's a system that's dependent upon preserving the privileges of a few. But it's sold to us as freedom. So the how we get there, I think, will be very important. So if we look at in the next time, the early modern stuff. So if we're looking at 16th, 17th, 18th century developments, how we go from mercantilism to the Industrial Revolution, people can see how the capitalist system reaches its height, like its greatest, like free market type stuff, and the whole invisible hand question you asked earlier. And then from there, we'll look at a lot of the critiques it runs into in the 19th and 20th century in the in a third part here.
Love it.
Time-wise, very hard to do in an hour.
Because if I'm listening to you, I'd want to put this on repeat regularly. Like I need to, for me as a learner, I'm video and audio, and I would want to listen to it repeatedly so that it resonates. Just the type of learner I am, and I'm sure hopefully the audience can go back and listen to this continuously. And so I just want to thank you again for a terrific episode. And everyone that's watching, it's Office Hours with JL, with Jamal and Liam. And we wore different shirts today, dude. I mean, it's cool that we did. I wore black today, and I won't flex like I did earlier. That was not a win. But what the hell? Let's just do it. Episode.
We're selling supplements and stuff.
Well, here we are. Capitalism at its best.
Hey, all those Charles Atlas ads in the back of the comic books when I was a kid.
This is what you get if you watch our episode.
Send $1 away to this guy, and he'll show you how to do it. So send $1 to JBS, and he will show you how to do this.
That's right. Look, you can look like this too for $1 a day. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. This is what we need. We need a little bit of levity at the end. Yeah. What do you want to say to the audience at the end before wrap up, man?
Oh god. You mentioned shirts. Mine's kind of themed here too. Like, so,
what you're saying.
Work, obey, consume, turn into gears.
Oh my goodness. See?
Very much fit the theme here. Especially if we got into the all the diggers and the early critiques of industrialization. Because the idea, here's a fun one just as a teaser for where we're going to go, right?
Right.
People today take for granted the idea of getting a job. We all have to work. We have to work for a living. We all have to make money. Right. People in the 18th century would think you were batshit crazy for making that statement because it made no sense at all. For most of human history, people worked for themselves.
Yeah.
They did not have a job, and you did not depend upon making money. You didn't need it. People could go, weeks and weeks and weeks without spending a penny. Our system is extraordinarily different, and it's what people mean by the idea of the wage system. Being a way of controlling people. Ultimately, it locks them in to a particular system where there's really no way out. There's no way to live the way people used to. It's just not possible anymore. And this is why. Walking through the development of capitalism as a system will be useful. There is how we create this kind of system where work for somebody else, getting a job, is normal. Because again, in human history, it's just not normal. So,
and I think what you mentioned earlier. I mean, the idea of getting a job, making a certain amount of money, and you're comfortable in that position, then you make more money, and your expenses increase. You make more money and your expenses increase. It's really hard to be comfortable where you say, at some point, not all of us can say, I don't need to work anymore.
No one ever can. And that's the thing. You're told to work hard to get comfortable, which you never do because there's that lifestyle creep. So now you're making $200K a year and you're in debt because you have the lifestyle of a person who makes $200K a year. So you're stuck keeping up with all that. So it's the same. You're always stuck working more and more. It's not possible to get ahead working for somebody else. Yeah. It's just not how it works. So it's very much a systemic issue. And people often are dealing with questions like capitalism at the base, at the level of how they get by. They're making money, the way they deal with banks and work and blah, blah, blah. And that's not capitalism. Capitalism is a system. It's an architecture. And if we understand the way the rules were written and why they work the way they do, then we can understand how we can envision a system that works better for more people and isn't leaving 90% of the planet behind. That's the goal there. And whatever you call that ultimately doesn't matter, but a system that's designed to maintain the privileges of the rich and hurt most people is not a good use of an economy.
Makes sense. I have a last question for you. So second episode, we're done. Where will this be posted or published?
Oh, so yeah, good point. So right now they're still going up on a YouTube channel. So there's a section on my Office Hours with the Mad Professor YouTube that already has a section designed dedicated for this. We still need to decide if you want like a separate YouTube channel that also will mirror it somewhere else in 2 places in YouTube, but ultimately I don't know that that's necessary. Up to you. But in addition to being on the YouTube channel, on the overall Office Hours YouTube channel, it's also in audio form only in several podcasting places. So if you're on Spotify, Amazon, Apple, Podbean, and iHeartRadio, it's in all of those already in audio.
Awesome.
So the first episode can be streamed in audio only as a podcast on those. But video format, Perfect. If you want to see my ugly mug and you want to see Jamal flex, then you got to watch the video, bro.
Then you go flex.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're hearing this only on audio, you didn't get to see Jamal's guns, so you got to go to YouTube to see that.
That's right. And so if I go to Apple or Spotify, what do I look it up under? The Mad Professor?
No, it should just be Office Hours with JNL.
Perfect. Folks, I don't know what to tell you other than I'm so excited we got our second episode done. It was a great conversation. For those of you that are watching, you have just experienced the launch of our second episode. And we're so excited that you are supporting us. For those involved in the editing, the design of a lot of what you see here, the Office Hours logo, we so much appreciate you. We appreciate the support. Don't miss Liam on Friday nights on TikTok for his Office Hours. And his Office Hours go much longer than this. And catch my book club every Tuesday and Thursday at 7:40 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on TikTok. And my username is JBS TikTok Dad. And Liam's is Liam O'Mara the 4th, right, Liam?
Yeah, it's just Liam O'Mara, then the IV for the Roman 4. But the TikTok, hates political content, so that current one is suspended there. So you got to add PhD to the end of it to find me on TikTok now.
Awesome.
But all my other social media is just Liam, Liam O'Mara, and then IV at the end.
And you join me for the book clubs whenever you get a chance to get perspective.
You're off next week though, right?
Yeah, no book club tomorrow, and I because I'll be out of town, and then I'm gone. I'm thinking of hosting one on Monday before I leave on Tuesday. So I'll keep you posted. And do you want to stop recording at this point so we could talk about the books?
Sure. But, we should say goodbye first. So.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks very much, y'all. It's a great night.
Yeah. So, ciao. Arrivederci. Assalamu alaikum. Inshallah nashukru al arib. And sayonara. Ciao.